How many of you were surprised to hear on Tuesday a story, a report that came out that Daniel Kretinsky was not going to take part in any of our transfer dealings this coming summer? No, I wasn't surprised at that story either. Look, the biggest non-story of yesterday was apparently that Daniel Kretinsky was not going to be involved in the transfer dealings. He was going to keep himself at arm's length. And look, the biggest shareholder at West Ham for all the years that he's been at West Ham so far has kept himself at arm's length at just about everything. So I'm not really surprised at this story, to be quite honest with you. So if it's not going to be Daniel Kretinsky who's going to be involved in transfers, who is going to be in charge of the summer transfer charade? Well, with Tim Steidten gone, many fans are fearing or speculating or actually knowing that it's going to be David Sullivan once again to be in charge of our transfer wheeling and dealing. And with that, many West Ham fans are fearing, or they have a sense of deja vu of how well or how badly it could go. Yet again, we have a manager in Graham Potter who's got different ideas to Julian Lopetegui, his predecessor, who in turn had different ideas to his predecessor, David Moyes, who in turn had different ideas to Manuel Pellegrini. So whoever's in charge, there's going to be a rebuild done again in the guise of the current manager or head coach. We've had this now for the past 6 or 7 summers. And with David Sullivan involved, it's going to be quite interesting to see how it really goes. Now, after spending such vast fortunes, by now, we should be in a position of having just to tweak the squad we have rather than have to keep rebuilding it over and over again. Instead, this summer, we're yet again faced with having to bring in anything up to possibly a dozen players to accommodate the possible dozen players who could be leaving. Now, not only do we have to find replacements for players who are older at the end of their contracts, but we've also got to consider replacing those who do not seem to want to be at West Ham United any longer. Why? Because one thing, we can't offer them European football. You see, that's been one of the problems of our recruitment of late. We've been able to use the European football as a carrot dangling in front of the likes of Lucas Paqueta, Mohammed, Kudus, and the like. But once that carrot is no longer there, these players haven't come in just to play against Southamptons of this world, but they've come in to try and compete against clubs in European football. And fair play. All right. Everybody, all players, good players, want to play in European competitions. I don't have a problem with that. But it leaves us with a problem when we don't have European football to offer. So who's to blame for the mess that we're in yet again in having to rebuild our squad almost from scratch? Well, in fairness, everyone at West Ham or has been at West Ham or is still currently at West Ham has got a lot to answer for. David Sullivan, for example, he can't stop continuing to meddle in the transfer market, and the agents who he has relied on far too much to bring in players who may or may not fit the system that we have. They're responsible as well. Now, some players that have come in via the likes of Barry Silkman and Will Sorthouse have worked out pretty well, but others haven't. But the inconsistency with our approach to player purchases has led us to be not able to build future-proof squads. We haven't done that. So how's it going to be any different now that we've got Graham Potter at the club? Well, we once thought that the introduction of a director of football under Pellegrini was the start of a new dawn for transfers at the club. Sullivan soon lost faith with that approach and sacked both Pellegrini and Mario Husilos. And then we went on to David Moyes' era, where he wanted full and total control of transfers. But as much as Moyes quoted at one point that he would treat the club's money as if it was his own, he was woefully wasteful when it came to some of the transfers, some of the players that we had already bought, or some of the transfers that he was targeting. He got rid of players who came in at a very high price and usually got rid of them for a massive loss. And he also brought in players at with big fees. But again, if you couldn't handle them, they too went at a massive loss. In the end, we ended up, relying on the tried and trusted players that we'd had for years, Aaron Creswell, at Mikel Antonio, and the like. Now, when Tim Steidten was appointed, again, we thought it was going to be a new era in the way transfer business was done at the club. But the way Steidten went about his business last summer, it ended up with, we could have done it without his help. Why? Because he brought in older, injury-prone players like Fulkrug. We could have done that without Steidten. He brought in journeymen who hadn't quite made it at bigger clubs and brought them in, like Soler. We could have done that. And then he brought in older players who are meant to be experienced and have some stability about them, like Rodriguez. Again, none of this really worked out. Fulkrug, maybe, if Fulkrug stays another season and if he stays injury-free, then maybe that one might work out. But on the whole, it hasn't been that great. And Steidten has also tried to think about the future as well by bringing in what might become a pearl in Luis Guilherme. And perhaps he's beginning to show some way of demonstrating that he is capable of being able to withstand the pressures of Premier League football. Let's see. That might or might not work out. The Steidten experience just on the whole didn't work. And with all the noise about how great a director of football he was, he currently is without a club. And there are no signs of any big clubs around Europe queuing up to sign him. But let's be honest, let's face it, even if Steidten had a perfect transfer window, with David Sullivan lurking, something is always going to go wrong. And indeed, it did, because Sullivan ignored all the warnings and decided to hire Huden Lopetegui as David Moyes' successor. Now, with all the decent Basque Country coaches that we have, in Pep Guardiola and various others, how did we manage to get the one that just wasn't going to work out? Anyway, Sullivan did this before. He was hearing Champions League theme tunes in his head when he went out and hired Manuel Pellegrini. And I think he was thinking much the same with Lopetegui. Here was a man who managed Spain, who managed Real Madrid. Surely he's going to bring success. But it doesn't always work that way, does it? Sullivan is just a nightmare when it comes to hiring managers. And it goes back to what I said earlier. He's not thinking about the long term. He's thinking about the here and now, which means that we hire different managers to the previous ones, which means that when those managers comes in, they have a different footballing philosophy. And then we start looking at having to build squads in his guise rather than looking at building a squad that any manager can take over. So I asked the question, why is it going to be any different now that Graham Potter and his head of recruitment, Kyle Macauley, are at the club? Now, the fact of the matter is quite simple. If Sullivan insists on sticking his oar in, then there may not be much difference at all. Now, when we hear that, for example, Will Sorthouse might once again become a main advisor to Sullivan this summer, then you just know that there could be one or two players on his books winging their way to West Ham this summer. Now, whether they suit what Potter wants or needs might almost seem quite irrelevant. But you know what? When you look at some of the players on the books of Sorthouse's agency, Unique Sports Group, he does have some decent talent there. Anthony Gordon, Brennan Johnson, Mark Guay, Jacob Ramsey, to name a few. So if we get linked to the likes of AC Milan centre-back Malik Thau, 21-year-old striker Karim Konate of Red Bull Salzburg, or young goalie Noah Atunolu from Freiburg, or even centre-backs Omar Saleh or Taylor Harwood-Bellis, just remember which agency they're currently with. Yep, they're all with Sorthouse's Unique Sports Group. In fact, ironically, we have been linked to all the players that I've just mentioned in one summer transfer window or another. Now, would it be so bad if McAuley was to rely on someone like Sorthouse and his agency to provide players to West Ham? Well, not so bad if Potter believes that they can improve West Ham and that they can fit in with the style of football that Potter wants to play. I guess it's only bad if he has these players forced on him just because Salthouse is mates of Sullivan. And for the record, at this moment in time, we've actually got 6 players at West Ham who are already Salthouse clients. Now, not all 6 are currently with the club. There are 1 or 2 out on loan, but I bet you'll have a hard time naming all 6 of those players. So, what role will Macauley have in all of this? What are his credentials, and how will he be any better than any of the other directors of football or heads of recruitment that we've had in the past? Now, first of all, Macauley has, as we know, has had a long-standing professional relationship with Graham Potter. He's worked alongside him at clubs like Östersunds, Swansea, Brighton, Chelsea, and now at West Ham. His expertise in recruitment and scouting has been highly valued, and he's known for his ability to identify young talent with great potential. Macauley, he's brought with him to West Ham a data-driven and strategic approach to the recruitment process. He's known for his analytical expertise, and he's been instrumental in integrating advanced data analysis into the club scouting and recruitment system. Now, this approach helps to identify undervalued players and reduces the risk associated with high-value transfers, which is particularly important given the financial constraints that Sullivan keeps reminding us of. Macaulay's extensive network and experience from his time at previous clubs will have allowed him to bring a broad database of potential transfers to West Ham this coming summer. He's already been actively networking with agents and players to prepare for the upcoming transfer window to ensure that the club stay ahead of the competition in the market. And it could be, I dare say, that some of the agents that he's already been speaking to have already been Salthouse and maybe Barry Silkman. He works closely with Potter when discussing the type of players that are needed at the club. Potter has stated that with Macauley by his side at West Ham, he knows instinctively what he needs, and that saves Potter the time and effort to have to do the hard work in identifying the players to bring into the club. So he can focus on coaching the players whilst Macauley goes out and looks for them. And he said they're on the same wavelength. But does data-driven and player analysis work? Is it any better than the traditional scouting methods? Traditional scouting relies heavily on expertise and intuition of scouts, who go and watch the players, maybe watch players on video or watch them in person. They assess things like technical skill, attitude, leadership, composure. And scouts can evaluate players within the context of specific matches, and which might be difficult to capture through data. And while valuable, traditional scouting is often subjective. 2 scouts might look at a player and interpret their performances completely differently, which can lead to inconsistent evaluations. Whereas data-driven analysis provides measurable metrics such as passing accuracy, shot conversion rates, distances covered, and these metrics allow for objective comparisons between players. And data can analyze thousands of players across multiple leagues all at the same time. And they can identify hidden gems in less scouted areas. Now, analytics can uncover trends and player profiles that might not be immediately visible through the traditional scouting method. For example, if a player excels in high pressing systems, that might stand out in the data that's been provided. Now, look, there's no better way. Some managers prefer to see for themselves. Others rely on the data-driven scouts to spot players to fit the mold that they require. Some teams have been successful, very successful, under the data-driven system. For example, Liverpool. Michael Edwards' approach helped to identify the likes of Mo Salah and Andrew Robertson. Brentford have relied heavily on data-driven analysis to target players. And Borussia Dortmund's discovery of Erling Haaland was instrumental before his value skyrocketed. And of course, at Brighton, Under Macauley, it worked effectively in helping to identify players such as Moses Caicedo. And Macauley was looking at his defensive midfield metrics in a league that was not usually very well scouted. That was Ecuador. Now, Brighton, as we know, they ended up buying the player and then they loaned him out. And then once his loan spell was over, he came back to Brighton and he was sold for a vast profit of £110 million to Chelsea. And this is kind of what I'm expecting from Macauley at West Ham. I don't expect any big names to be coming to the club. I expect to see younger players walking through the door. I expect to see maybe one or two unfamiliar names at low prices, which have, players have got huge potential to become big stars over the next season or two. Mixed with that, we may get to see a seasoned professional or two to ensure that we've got a good balance of stars of tomorrow with stars who know how the Premier League works. But what I don't expect to see, to be really honest, is a Will Salthouse client who's reached near the end of his career and the end of his current contract to be signed for West Ham anytime soon. And let's hope in that respect that David Sullivan doesn't interfere too much this summer, or we may end up with a player who really does not want to be, or we don't want to have at the club.